and it really has profound implications for folks who are dealing, for example, with somebody who passed away, because it suggests very strongly that the process of death is not an end, but it's a transition, right? And so it's providing scientific rigor to the idea that what we're talking about is not a loss in the same sense that many people feel that it is.
Dr. Dunne is president of the International Consciousness Research Laboratories, ICRL, an organization established in 1997 to continue the research of the effects of consciousness on physical energy systems, carried out at Princeton University from 1979 to 2007.
Those were the kinds of things that happened. There were some interesting effects when people went into it with sort of awe and complete bafflement. I don't know how to do this. Usually that first time, they tended to get really good effects. There is another set of solutions to those same equations. It was not really paid attention to at the time because the solutions involve a square root of -1, which at the time people were like, well, it's just a mathematical artifact. We're not taking it seriously. And also because that set of solutions paints a different picture, one in which energy and information are flowing backward in time.
Hi, everyone. Today I'm talking with Jeff Dunne. So, Jeff, tell us a little bit about yourself and what you're working on.
Okay. Well, one of the things I guess about me, if when you say, what am I working on, or tell me a little bit about yourself, probably I should say that one of the most defining traits of myself is I tend to be a generalist, almost a compulsive generalist. I like a lot of different things, and I get involved in pretty much whatever excites me, which tends to be all over the place. So for a day job, I do a lot of data science, recently involved in artificial intelligence, as most data scientists are these days. But from sort of a historical perspective, I've done acoustics and nuclear physics, environmental engineering, and all kinds of things like that. But perhaps most central to my personal interests is as a researcher into the nature of consciousness and something of a practitioner in trying to identify how we can use an improved understanding of the nature of consciousness to try to make the world a little bit better for ourselves and obviously for our kids. So looking at how we can leverage that. My background is I grew up in many ways in a laboratory that was focused on researching consciousness and the effect of intention on what are considered to be sort of objective systems. And so I grew up in this arena, and that was kind of a very formative aspect of my life. So it's maybe not surprising that I like to sort of approach things from a lot of different angles.
I hadn't known you also did stuff with AI. I'm going to have, and nuclear physics. I'm going to have questions I'm going to add on about that, both of those, and AI and consciousness. But first, so you're currently doing some research into the nature of consciousness, and did you either found or a part of the ICRL group? So what is that, and what's your role with them?
Yeah, thanks. The International Consciousness Research Laboratories is what ICRL stands for. It is a not-for-profit organization that was founded in the late 90s, and its intent was to be a vehicle for carrying on the research that was being done at Princeton from the late 70s through the mid 2000s. That research program at the university was stood up by at the time that it was stood up, the dean of engineering. And he later stepped down as dean to focus on the laboratory and the laboratory was part of his research. He also did aerospace research. And they, in doing that work and studying the nature of anomalies and human-machine interactions and things of that nature, realized as time went on over the course of essentially 30 years that This work, even though they had essentially established a body of work that was important and it was going to stand on its own, that there was a lot more to do. And they, Robert John and my mother, Brenda Dunne, they founded the International Consciousness Research Laboratories in order to carry that on. So the charity itself had, or I should say has, because it still does, three main foci. One was to continue on the research. The second was to share that with as broad an audience as possible. And then the third was to look at the applications, right? Not just do the research, but understand what is it that we can now do with this, having learned what we did. And so ICRL has been around for about 25 years, a little bit more. And the initial focus was probably 80% on publishing. So we've got an imprint called ICRL Press. We've published 20 books. But especially in more recent years, we've gotten a lot more active at starting new research projects, looking, for example, at consciousness as it relates to bees, kind of a cool project looking at when bees swarm. And that's something that's going on right now. We had a really cool project that has been going on for a couple of years, looking at moment of death experiences and being able to detect shifts in the nature of consciousness with the same equipment that was used at Princeton. Just a week and a half ago, we were out in Portugal working with the International Academy of Consciousness, doing an experiment looking at out-of-body experiences, as a matter of fact. So a lot of really cool stuff, but also the ICRL focuses a lot on trying to spread awareness of what's going on. So we have talks and we try to bring organizations together to work together and sort of function as a coherent community.
Okay, so I actually want to talk about all three of those. First, the
Okay.
bees. What is the experiment and what have you discovered about bees?
Well, the experiment is to establish some bee monitoring equipment around these hives, and with the goal of seeing when bees are going to have a meaningful event within their lives, which for bees tends to be swarming, or at least the ones that we know about. So when a hive decides it's time to split, sort of reproduce as a hive, to see whether or not there would be any kind of effect that we would be able to detect using random event generators. What we discovered the first year was that bees are shy. And so when we were monitoring it, the bees all went, "Nah, no, we're not going to swarm this year. Sorry." And then the next year, COVID hit, and so we didn't do anything. And now we're just standing it up again this year to see if we can get better data. So we have, unfortunately, no data at the moment, but we're hopeful for this year that we'll be able to pull something together.
Okay, so what made you choose bees?
They are kind of almost an archetype of a group mind. We could have chosen ants, for example. Bees was just sort of presented itself. It was the idea of somebody that is part of ICRL, but also works with something called the Galileo Commission, which is a project under the Scientific and Medical Network. And he knew some beekeepers, and we all decided, yeah, this makes a lot of sense as a project to go. So it was kind of just a bit of circumstance, but also knowing that bees have a certain something to them as well.
And kind of ties into like a collective consciousness, like think of a consciousness field or like the Global Consciousness
Right.
Project, which we can talk a little more about later. Now, the next research project you said you've done there is, um, you said it was about at the moment of death. Am I correct?
Yeah.
So, what is that? What are you studying?
So we had set up some random event generators in an ICU unit, and we're looking for signals that would occur at a moment of death. Was there something that was significant in sort of that consciousness field, if you will, that we would be able to detect using the random event generator data streams? And the initial results were incredibly promising. We were finding very, very strong signals, deviations from randomness. So, a random event generator, in theory, should just be providing a series of ones and zeros at random. But in these moments of sort of relevant resonance kinds of consciousness related things, they display structure. And this is the same. This was the kind of signal that the pair work at Princeton was detecting, where they had many, many millions of trials demonstrating that indeed there was some kind of effect that was going on. It's not huge. It doesn't change, for example, your probabilities from 50-50 to 25-75, but it will change it, for example, to say 49.99, 50.01, which doesn't sound like a lot, except that when you're doing this over the course of millions and millions of trials, the statistical likelihood of that is essentially zero. So when you've got that much data and you're seeing a consistent pattern with all of this, it's demonstrating that there's a real effect. We really are able to affect systems, and those systems are being affected really most effectively when the person with the intention is trying to build some kind of connection or resonance with a device. Well, we were doing this experiment that said, can we set up the devices that are sort of tuned with the intention of detecting significant moments? And for a patient in the ICU, where we anticipate potentially that they are going to pass away, to be able to detect something like that. And indeed, what we found was, yeah, um, presentations were originally given about this research about 2 years, or pardon me, a year ago, at a conference in Spain. We're doing another one this coming month in May, and it really has profound implications for folks who are dealing, for example, with somebody who passed away, because it suggests very strongly that the process of death is not an end, but it's a transition, right? And so it's providing scientific rigor to the idea that what we're talking about is not a loss in the same sense that many people feel that it is. And there are a lot of evidence that points in this direction. Not near death experiences, out of body experiences, lots of different things. But this is one where somebody can say, well, maybe I don't need to exactly grieve in the sense of total loss. So the idea of being able to improve somebody's ability to handle what is obviously a very difficult time is very exciting.
And so, how would the random number generator being affected at the moment of death? Actually, I will let me first ask you, how long does the effect last? Is it like the full 24 hours after the person passes, an hour before they pass, or is it maybe 5 minutes during the moment of passing?
It does vary. And part of it is because I think the circumstances in each time vary. So there's that whatever's happening at the consciousness level is obviously not just for that person. If the person's family, if they're quite close to their family, the relationship of the family may cause the sort of the process of death to be longer or shorter than it is for somebody else, and so forth. So I wouldn't we didn't see a consistent pattern in that respect, nor would we have expected to. But in general, what we saw were effects that were sort of exhibiting themselves over the span of a couple of hours, sometimes starting earlier. And this is again just a hypothesis, there's no way for us to know this. For example, if somebody started to get that sense, this is my time, right? And they begin to kind of go through that transition even before their physiology catches up with the idea that they're dying. Um, and then continuing on, and the again, in circumstances, the relationship could be for an hour or two afterwards very sensibly, because they're in many ways still quite tightly connected at an emotional level or spiritual level with the loved ones. So it really did vary from case to case.
And was there a significant difference if someone had, say, 10 loved ones in the room with them versus one? Like, how do you eliminate that it's the loved ones'
Right.
thoughts that aren't influencing? the generator?
Yeah, that's a great question. The pure answer, scientifically speaking, is we can't. Right. There's a couple of things that we can do to sort of minimize the effect of that. One is that you don't tell the loved ones the REG is there and doing things, right? So they're not sort of consciously trying to affect the device in some way, because that would, and to be honest, it's the last thing they need to be thinking about at that time anyway. So it's not something that they would really need to. I think that I don't, everybody was aware. There was no monitoring that was being done that was sort of behind the scenes or whatever. But there is no way to be absolutely certain. But one of the things that comes out of all of this research into consciousness is that we are fundamentally an interconnected macro system or ecosystem, or however you want to describe that. We're interconnected. We're interconnected with our loved ones. We're interconnected with the environment. We're with everything. And so when it comes to matters like this, it is very difficult to separate exactly what one thing is versus another, because when a loved one feels something, that impacts the person themselves. When they are feeling something, the loved one is. And how you can tie that in to a random event generator data stream, we don't have the answer for that. We do know that there's an effect. We can absolutely see that, but the specifics of the cause and effect, we really can't. And in fact, it's quite possible that, um, pardon me, for reasons maybe we'll get into in a little bit, having to do with independence from time, it may be that there really isn't a good explanation for how that works from a mechanism perspective. In fact, there's a lot of evidence that suggests that the mechanism is not going to be a mechanism like we normally think of these things, in the sense of like, well, first this, and then this caused that, and then that caused the other, that it doesn't really function that way. Because one of the other findings from the research that's been done is that the effect, it works just as well throughout time, which is to say that if I'm sort of trying to affect a system right now, I can have an effect. If I try to affect a system that's going to run next week, I can have an effect. If I try to affect a system that ran last week, well, I can still have an effect. It's not dependent on time. And in fact, it's also not dependent on space. So if you're trying to affect a system that's sitting in the room with you, it doesn't matter if you reach out and you touch that system, you go into the next room, you go into the next state, you go halfway around the world, space doesn't have anything to do with it. So in the absence of space and time, it's very difficult to articulate what a mechanism would be. What the research seems to suggest, however, is that it's about outcomes. It's about, you know a relationship. The metaphor that I really like to use to describe this is that in in setting the intention to have an effect, in essence, what you're doing is you're kind of setting an attractor towards some future outcome, and the universe finds a way of making all the details work out to get to the outcome that you have that intention towards. And that's a very short description of this, and maybe we'll dive into more detail. But I don't want to go forever. That could be an hour long discussion itself.
Well, I'm definitely going to circle back to everything you said about both the mechanism and time. But I also want to ask you then about the third research that you mentioned in conjunction with the IAC, which is the International Academy of Consciousness. And I know I've written about them and mentioned them before. So what was this experiment you did with? Was it with Nancy and Wagner?
It was, yeah, yeah.
Okay.
This is actually the second time we did it. The first time was sort of a dry run for us, so we were able to do this experiment this year much more, with much greater fluency in terms of the things that we were trying to achieve. In essence, what we had was a group of 8 people, and we got together for 5 days at Nancy and Wagner's facility in Portugal. And as a group, we would learn about out of body experience techniques, and then try to have out of body experiences following those techniques. And then when we weren't functioning as a group, individuals would try to do their own out of body experiences as well. And then we had these RHEs that were monitoring everybody along through the whole 5 days. So we did the out of body. But we also would, for example, take different excursions and do some energetic work and things like that. That to see if we could also detect that as a group and so forth. Um, and yeah, and so this just finished a week ago. I haven't even had a chance myself to look at the data yet.
That was going to be my question, what the results of the data were. So you don't know yet.
I do not know yet. I got back this past week and then immediately got sick. so so
Oh
I have
no, I'm sorry.
so I haven't had a chance. And when you hear me cough, such as like that, that's the tail end of it. So yeah, I haven't even had a chance to open up the data and look at it yet. It's just been so I'm kind of itching to see what it looks like
Maybe.
myself. But I think it may be a little while, so we'll follow up with that at a later time because
Got it.
just doing the analysis is. Uh, you got to look at it and then you've got to sort of do a lot of scrubbing and convincing yourself that what you've got is sort of holds up scientifically and to really assess it. So I don't think it'll be something to do in a couple of days. It'll take me a bit of time.
Okay. Well, yeah, let me know when you get the
Sure.
results and we
Okay.
can update. So now I want to go back to what you were saying about the random event generators, random number generators,
Hmm.
and time. So just to clarify, when people influence them, they're given the task of focusing on, say, getting more ones than zeros, and that's their goal. And
Right.
now you said, I don't even know how to ask this question, but because I'm so mind, I don't even understand fully what you're saying, so I want to discuss it further. They can affect them in the past. So you would, for example, take someone who's known to have a strong effect on random event generators or random number generators, maybe a meditator or someone who's been shown to have strong effect, and say, affect this random number generator last Wednesday. Is that what you would do, for example? And then,
Well, let me give you a little sort of take one step back in introducing this to where it was with the Princeton research. One of the things that was was an important protocol for the laboratory was, in fact, that they did not use any gifted people. And in fact, if you came in and said, "I'm really good at this," nobody would stop you from trying it for sure. Everybody was welcome to do it, but they would not include that data in the data set. That in fact, what Princeton's data specifically focused on was just your average person. Students, people who heard about it, wanted to come in and try it, but people who were particularly known to be particularly strong influencers of systems, they were not. They were sort of excluded from the data set in terms of the overall Princeton analysis, because the real question was whether or not this was a property that was part of sort of human nature, or just consciousness nature in general. So it was now that said, it was absolutely the case that people who were strong meditators and so forth did tend to do better at that, which begs a couple of questions like, what is the effect that's going on? And a couple of things that turned out to be really important in how a person was able to affect the system was getting into the right state of mind. The right state of mind tended to start with getting out of your head. People who were made it very intellectual, that was not a particularly effective way to go. And in fact, most people who found themselves having a strong effect when asked, "Well, what were you doing at that time?" would say, I wasn't demanding, I wasn't shooting, rays of influence or anything like that. Um, I was establishing a relationship with a machine. And in many ways, a good way to describe this is to break down the boundaries between what was the person and the device. They sort of blurred that line a little bit. So instead of saying, well, you will do what I want, you became part of a partnership. Hey, wouldn't it be fun if you and I together got more ones than zeros? And so those were the kinds of things that happened. There were some interesting effects when people went into it with sort of awe and complete bafflement. I don't know how to do this. Usually, that first time, they tended to get really good effects. The first time people try it, they tend to get great, great deviations and things like that. Most people, if not all people, immediately go, aha, I know what I'm doing now. And then the effect just goes away. And then as they regain a little bit of humility and going, oh, I'm not really sure anymore, then the effect would start to come back. So there was definitely something in there that was clear that it was an important part of that was getting out of your head, going with the emotional level, the connection level, rather than the intellectual level. And then, it's sort of natural to say, okay, well, what are the things, here's something that I can do to maybe be a little bit better about that. People who are meditators, who are more practiced at getting out of their intellectual selves and into, more of a state of resonance with their surroundings, naturally we're better. Well, what what other kinds of effects are there? And this is sort of where this started. Most of the experiments were done where you're sitting in front of the REG, and you're maybe 2 feet away from it or something like that. And you sort of wonder, well, would it be better if I reached out and I touched it? I put my hands on it. No, it made no difference. Well, okay, I don't need to touch the device, but I'm sitting here. Well, what if I take a step back? Doesn't matter. And this is where you start going, well, let me go in the other room and try it. Didn't make any difference. What if I go in another building and try it? Didn't make any difference. How about if I try it from some other state? How about if I try it from some other country? It didn't make any difference. The space had nothing to do with it. Um, and that
Meaning
naturally,
people were still having effects. Those that
people were
were able
still
to have effects were having effects still.
people were having effects, and if they could be 2 feet away or 2,000 miles away, and the effect was the same. And so, if space has nothing to do with it, it's natural to ask, well, what about time, right? So, if I run the experiment and I have the intention at the same time, that was the traditional way of going about it. The natural next question is, well, what if I have my intention now and I allow the machine to run a week from now or a month from now or whatever it is? And they found that, nope, that works just as well. And so then you get this crazy idea. Well, if I can affect it in the future, could I have the machine run and then,
Wait, can I just get clarity about
yeah,
how it would be? So people, let's say on February 1st, for example, everyone was focusing on, that more ones than zeros, a higher percent of ones than zeros. And then you turn on the machine, say March 1st, and they were told to focus on this specific machine in this specific place, and they focus it for it in February. And then you turn it on in March, and the it would have the effect.
right.
And were they told what date, or they were just told to focus on it the same way, or were they told focus on it for March?
In the experiments that were being done, it was set. So, for example, the experimenter would be told, I want you to have the intention now, but I'm going to run the device at some point in the future. And that was not left in the experiments as a variable to the person. They knew at that time when that was going to be.
They
uh,
knew the date it would be, or they just knew sometime in the future?
no, I think they knew the date that it was going to be.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's And then you'd turn it on then, and then it would have the effect. And then I assume you'd have control ones that people weren't focusing on, and they would have no effect, right? The
Right.
control machines.
Yep.
So
And so,
okay.
in fact, all the experiments that were run would have essentially be done in three, or in sets of three. You would have an intention to go high, more ones than zeros. You'd have an intention to go low, more zeros than ones. And then you would run a baseline where you had no intention whatsoever. So all of the data was always run with this sort of uh, this three-part protocol. So you always had something to compare against to look at what the deviations are.
Okay. And now the past.
And then the
What?
past, right?
Ha- let's hear how that even.
So,
I don't even know how to conduct an experiment for that.
so same kind of thing. You run, for example, now in this case, you turn on your machine, you run it for whatever number of minutes on February 1st, and then on March 1st, you ask your operator to say, look, we ran the machine on February 1st, and I want you to influence whether or not it's high, low, and so forth, to have the same kind of influence. Now, of course, nobody's looked at the data, right? And this is an important piece of this. And this ties into what makes this important is primarily uh, what allows a person to have an effect is that there's a certain uncertainty in this, right? If a person believes that there is no possibility of having an effect, they typically do not have an effect, right? So if somebody, I think if they had done the protocol where they had run the data and somebody had looked at it and then somebody said, hey, I want you to go influence it, I believe that would have had a very deteriorating effect on the results. Similarly, one of the things that would happen not infrequently was people would come back and say, I've tried to reproduce your results and I'm not getting it. And at one point, out of sort of confusion, the folks running the Paralab said, well, can we go see what it is that you're doing in your protocol? And now, if you went into the Paralab when it was operating, the first thing that would happen is you'd sort of be sat down on this very large, comfortable orange couch. You'd be told to choose the stuffed animal of your choosing and to settle in. You'd have a talk a little bit about what was going on, and it would be a fun environment. Uh, some of the places that would come back, oh, we've done your protocol and it didn't work whatsoever. And then you go to that lab and you look at what they did. And uh, it was one of my mother's sort of favorite or worst stories, depending on how you look at it. She said she would go in and they would have somebody come in and they'd sit them down at a very clinical, table. And they'd start off with, well, some people believe that you can affect systems just with the power of your mind. uh, Now we're gonna show that isn't really the case, or but they had killed it before they ever started because they had convinced the operator that it was impossible before the operator even tried it. And so this kind of thing is really important when you do this, when you recognize that what you're dealing with is something that's fundamentally subjective because you're talking about a consciousness. There's nothing more subjective in the universe than a consciousness. You have to recognize that the consciousness has to have has to have a comfort that it may actually be able to do something. If you convinced yourself that you can't, chances are you're not going to be able to. And this is the same kind of thing with affecting something in the past. The protocol has to be set up in a way that you don't walk into the experiment with the sense that you're not going to be able to do it anyway. And so it was carefully designed that way. And of course, then we get to where we started this conversation, which is to find out, yeah, if you allow yourself to recognize that that's a possibility, indeed, in fact, you do have that effect. Um,
Wow.
yeah,
So it worked in the
and it
past.
worked. Yeah,
What? How do you even begin to explain that? I don't know what to even say.
it's so I have over the last several years found myself exploring a lot of different ways to explain it because it's challenging. The One of the best mechanisms for this that I have found comes from talking about a concept called syntropy. A lot of folks have heard of entropy. This is relatively known. And the principle of entropy, which comes about from the equations of physics and can be derived, uh, basically says that the universe, in left to its own devices, is going to become less ordered, more chaotic. Structure kind of goes away, and it that same set of solutions describes a universe in which energy and information propagate forward in time, and so forth. There is another set of solutions to those same equations. It was not really paid attention to at the time because the solutions involve a square root of -1, which at the time people were like, well, it's just a mathematical artifact. We're not taking it seriously. And also because that set of solutions paints a different picture, one in which energy and information are flowing backward in time. And rather than painting a picture like entropy does of a very causal universe, we do the things that we do because of that which happened in the past. Syntropy paints a purpose driven picture of the universe in which we do the things that we do because we are going towards some future purpose or some future attractor. Those two principles working together as complements do a really good job of explaining the universe. When you leave one of them out, your understanding starts to get pretty bad. For example, if you don't recognize the syntropic aspects of this, it's very difficult to explain why human beings evolved from amoebas instead of human beings evolving into amoebas, right? We shouldn't be evolving towards more structured things. We should be evolving into less structured things, but we don't, of course. Right? So, but working together, these two principles make a lot of sense. And it does now focus on this idea of what is the purpose? What is this idea of a future attractor? When you put that into the picture, a lot of this starts to make more sense. That what you do with your intention is you set an expectation within the universe, wherever it is in time, to have a particular outcome. And it's an outcome driven process that we're really looking at in all of this. And I'll give you an example as why I say that. As you described accurately, um, what operators are told is, for example, a high intention. I want you to get more ones than zeros. And so they typically would think, all right, I want more ones. I want more event counts. What nobody really talked about was the way the device works is that in order to make it robust, for example, you don't want to have a problem where if it heats up, you've got different data than otherwise. So the mechanism for how the devices work is they don't just count events. They actually compare this against a sort of what we would call a comb, a 101010. So you get a plus if you get a 1 where there's a 1 in the comb, or if you get a 0 where there's a 0 in the comb. And you get a 0 if you get a 1 and a 0 or a 0 and a 1, right? If they don't line up. So when you say, I want more ones, you're not actually getting more events out of the quantum mechanical effect or anything like that. You're just getting them to line up appropriately. But nobody knew this, right? You were just told, I want higher numbers. The way to get higher numbers was to insert structure to get the ones and the zeros to line up where the ones and the zeros should be. That happened, though. People were able to do that without ever being aware that that was something that needed to be done in order to make all of this work. Similarly, that we're talking about random event generators here, but that wasn't the only experiment that was done at Princeton. There was, for example, a huge mechanical cascade where you had 9,000 balls that would fall through a series of pegs, and in theory, statistically, it should create this bell-shaped distribution at the bottom. You could try to influence it to go left or to go right. Well, what are the odds that a person would be able to track 9,000 balls as they fell through? Almost essentially impossible. There were interferometer experiments where people were trying to affect patterns in light, or acoustic experiments, thermistor experiments affecting thermal things, or a fountain experiment, pendulum. All of these different experiments where people didn't really understand the physics of how they were working. They simply knew what the outcome was that they wanted. And so this idea that it's an outcome driven effect is really sustained by the data, right? It's not about people focusing on the mechanism. It's about focusing on the outcome. And it turns out that that outcome, you can focus on it now or in the future or in the past. And it does work, which has some very important implications for the nature of time.
Right. And I mean, I know you see this everywhere with this type of stuff, like the random number, the Global Consciousness Project. They
Mhm.
started to see results before 9/11, and yeah,
Yeah,
I I know that there's so many questions I want to ask about this, but I don't even think I know what questions to ask or how. It just shows that time is different than how we perceive it
yeah.
in our human bodies. That really seems to be, and you gave a much better explanation of that. That just seems to be the only thing I can kind of wrap my mind around.
And I find as I've been thinking through this a lot, and I give presentations on sort of the nature of time, and for example, what are the implications of all of this? That the strongest sort of way of thinking about this, the most internally consistent, is that time is an organizing principle that we use, right? That we insert in order to establish a sensible narrative by which we can relate our experiences. And when I say relate, I mean certainly relate them to others, but even to relate them to ourselves. Uh, and this is another case, for example, if you are familiar with the literature around near death experiences and you ask people, what was it that you experienced at this time? Many people will, having woken up, say, I couldn't tell you that while I was in the near death experience, that I was experiencing something in a time sequence. They simply experienced. All of the things essentially were happening. They happened, I should say, at whatever, but it wasn't in time. It's only when you come back and you say, I had this near death experience and now I've woken up. Now, I know that I was in a car accident. I know that I was pulled from the car. I know that I was given CPR. I know I was put into an ambulance. I know I was right. But it's only when they wake up that they can say, well, surely I had the car accident before I was taken out of the car. I must have been taken out of the car before I was given CPR. I must have been given CPR either before or while I was in transit to the right. And so they insert what is a logical sequence of time for this. The time does not, for people who sort of get out of the normal state of consciousness, time is not something that they find typically as being an inherent property of things. It's much more about the descriptions. It's us being able to make sense of our experiences and our sensations and to be able to explain it in the traditional, this is what it means to be alive kind of way. Which is great, which doesn't mean that time isn't important, right? It simply means that time is very much tied to our consciousness, a tool of our consciousness, rather than something that is a cage in which we are living. It's more of a set of agreements that we abide by in order to make sense of these things. And similarly, it's nice that if you look at what's gone on in quantum mechanics, and the idea of time and space and energy and momentum and all of these things are not properties themselves of a wave function. They're measurements we make on a wave function. They're the result of an observation process, right? They're the consciousness playing their effect in these properties. So
Do you
it
want to
does.
give one example of that for our listeners? I know there's obviously the split particle. Just give one that you find the most fascinating, because I don't know if everyone knows about these.
In terms of quantum mechanics, you mean?
Quantum mechanics and time, yeah.
Well, for example, the properties of a thing, when you talk about it in quantum mechanics, is the wave function. The wave function is the best description of this. But if you want to localize a thing, right? If you say, in order to ascribe a position onto the thing, what you're doing is you're making a measurement on that thing. You are asking it to essentially define a position. Until you make that measurement, it doesn't have an inherent position, right? It has a probabilistic representation. So it's the process of making the measurement or making the observation or essentially asking the question that ties it into it's sort of a set of axes in position or in time or all the rest of these. Um,
With
this could
quantum particles.
what's that?
With quantum particles.
Yeah, with quantum particles, exactly. But there are a lot of really nice parallels between what we're talking about, right? The idea of entanglement that shows up in quantum mechanics, and we were talking about the interconnectedness of all things, right? These things do tend to come together again. Yeah,
And do you think there are states of consciousness that we live in that are independent of time?
absolutely. Yes, I do. I've experienced them. I have talked to many people who have experienced them. And in fact, I think most people have. Uh, the the challenge with recognizing that is twofold. One, we're trained pretty early on in life not to pay attention to those things. There's a lot of social pressure that just we grow up in that says, no, 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 don't, right, don't talk about that. It's not real. I don't want you to pay attention to it, and so forth. And so we don't focus on it. We also don't have particularly good language for it. Right? Our language does not make it easy to talk about things. I've practiced for several years now talking about sort of the nature of consciousness outside of time. It's very challenging because your sentences try to form themselves in time-like structures. So you have to work really, really hard at it. Um, but I think there's a lot of things that we do, and certainly if anybody who's had lucid dreams, out of body experiences will say that things don't happen in a sequence that is the traditional time sequence. Certainly in space, right? Like I'm here and then I'm somewhere else, and there is no between those two. But time as well. Deep people who get into deep meditation will often describe it as a state of timelessness. um, so this, yeah, I think it's actually fairly common. And even if you say, well, what is dreaming for that matter? There is a sort of a timelessness or an outside of the traditional way of accounting for time that happens at any time somebody's dreaming, right? How is it that I can have a dream in which I experience years of a lifetime in my dream to wake up a few hours later? How did that? Right? It's not.
You said you've had experiences where you've been conscious out of time. Is there any experience you'd be comfortable sharing?
Well, I meditated a lot over the years. It was just, I guess, if you grow up in a laboratory focused on studying consciousness, you probably are inclined to that sort of thing, of course. So there are a great many times where, see, even there, you say a great many times. You can't get away from this whole description of time in the language. Great, there are a great many times where I have been in a state of meditation where truly there is no time. It just, the universe doesn't organize itself that way. So the more you practice at it, I think the easier it is. And then there's a whole range of these different things that are from the deep meditation kind of things to the out of body experience. Fine, that's that. But even people's experience of time in terms when they're not thinking that way, right? The fact that certain moments seem to last for other moments do not, right? Which we always sort of ascribe to being, well, that's just your perception, right? But that's an odd phrase, right? Because in many ways, what are we except for our perceptions, right? That's sort of the cornerstone of the human experience is our perceptions, or not just human experience, but I would argue any consciousness experience. I
That's
don't know if that
true.
answered your question, but
I think as much as this question can be answered. It's not the most answerable question. What is the entire nature of time? How do you
right,
explain the definition of consciousness? Not the easy answerable 1 plus 1 equals 2 questions.
yeah,
So you said you do work with AI. What are your thoughts on AI and consciousness? Could an AI develop an AI robot, an AI device? Could it develop consciousness?
sure. Well, to be fair in answering that, I would to give you my personal opinion on the whole thing. I believe that I am conscious. believe that you are conscious. I believe that my cat is conscious. I believe that my dog is conscious. I believe that the earth is conscious. And in fact, my model of sort of the world is there is everything. There's reality, and that reality itself, in and of itself, is a consciousness. It has an awareness, not an awareness like my awareness. Right, my awareness is considerably smaller. I'm a very small subset of that. And so I feel that pretty much everything, and I say pretty much, I really do mean everything, everything has a consciousness. Now, whether or not I can relate to it as a consciousness like mine depends on how similar that consciousness is. So you have consciousness, I have consciousness. We are really, really
Hey
similar.
everyone! I'm really excited to let you know about the science and spirituality salons I'm now hosting. During these intimate events, a scientifically verified psychic medium will give all of you readings, and I will give a talk on the science and evidence that changed my mind about an afterlife. This will also be an amazing opportunity to get to meet some of you in person or virtually and to share more about all the science and data that transformed my worldview and got me through my worst days. These can be hosted in your home, in a nearby cafe with a private room, or they can even be virtual. I've hosted a few already, and they were really special, fascinating, emotional, evidential. So if you're interested in getting a small group together over dinner, brunch, drinks, coffee, to learn more about the science and to get evidential medium readings, send me an email at hello@wtfjusthappened.net and put science and spirituality in the title.
Right? We're 99.99999% similar. We have our distinctions in the way that we see things, but they're not big, right? A little bit bigger of a gap maybe is between me and my cat. Okay, not the same. We have a different worldview, but it's not exactly the same. Me and a tree, slightly bigger still. Me and a rock, bigger still. Me and the earth, bigger still. Me and the solar system, bigger still. But I would argue that anything that we can imagine, and even those things that we can't imagine, have their own consciousness. It's just, I don't really know how to relate to it. By the time you get to something that's so radically different from myself, how would I even know what that consciousness looks like? So if I say I take something that you wouldn't normally think of as saying it's got consciousness, the emotion of bemused resignation, right? Like, okay, well, that's a sensation. I would argue that that has consciousness. I would argue its consciousness is so radically different than mine. I wouldn't really know necessarily how to connect to it unless I really practice very hard. And I have, tried to connect in different consciousnesses. Obviously I start as a to try the easier ones: another person, an animal, a tree. You sort of work your way through that. So, going back to your question, do I think an AI or a tool like what we have right now has consciousness? Yeah, because I think everything has a consciousness. Um, the things that we think about in terms of AI today, for example, the typical ones, the chat, large language models, and things that people are using, it's a very different kind of thing. Those are they are mathematical, and so I think it has a consciousness in the same way that I think the arctangent function on my calculator has a consciousness, right? Both of them are mathematical, algorithmic processes that you can go through. The LLMs are obviously considerably more sophisticated. They introduce a random element to them, which, by the way, is really interesting implications for everything we were talking about and what can happen to randomness through conscious intention. So they have the sophistication to feel like we are having a much more human-like interaction than some of the other ones. But I think that fundamentally the nature of whatever consciousness could evolve out of them is going to be radically different, and so radically different from us because they really are radically different. We just don't process the same way, for example.
So, an AI robot that we haven't yet been able to develop, but one that, in theory, and we're probably not too far away, of one that mimics human consciousness in, say, a robot that physically looks human, maybe not as human as a human, but like a doll, and mimics consciousness, you don't think it could evolve into a human level of consciousness, a similar experience?
I think there are a lot of elements that would need to be in place that are not and are likely not going to be in order to have an evolution in that direction. Um, there's there's I think a different line, which is kind of maybe where you're sort of teasing at, which is whether we could tell the difference, right? So, for example, the way these large language models work is they're statistical. You start with a prompt, and you then say, looking back at the however many trillions of documents that are there, I want you to take all of the possible first, what the token is the term for, tokens that I might start with, and and generate a distribution of which one's most likely. And then you pick a random number. And so most of the time you'll pick the most common one, but not always. Pick something else. And then you take that first token, you add it with all the prompt that you gave it, and you say, now I want you to generate a second one. You do the same thing. So you've got the statistics. So you're always running through a set of statistics to follow this complex algorithm. It's not, that process is not the cognitive process that we go through. For example, if I ask you a question, you don't start by saying, what's the most likely first word of my response? The. And then I say, well, I already started with the, so what's the next most likely? You process at a very different level in terms of the meanings at which you use. The AIs are not processing based on meanings, right? Because they don't have that. It's there's a metaphor that's used in this a lot, of somebody who's got a set of very complex rules but does not speak Mandarin. I don't know why they chose Mandarin as the example for this, but they're passed something in Mandarin, and then they follow a set of rules to take all the symbols that they get and create an output that's in Mandarin. They pass it along, and then the person on the other side who gets the result says, well, did the person in the middle give you a meaningful response to that? And they go, absolutely, they gave me a meaningful response. But the person in the middle doesn't speak Mandarin. They don't know what the message was that came in. They don't know what the message was that went out. They simply know that they followed the rules. And this is the same kind of thing that's happening with our large language models. We don't, it doesn't have an understanding the way that we have an understanding. It's following the rules to produce sensible outcomes that conform to the expectations that we have for it. So it's a very different way of processing information than what we have. And consequently, I don't think we're going to see that mechanism leading to something that has an understanding of, or an assertion of meaning the way that we do. At some later point, we may come up with other ways of doing that if we can get a machine to truly understand meaning or to ascribe meaning. But that is not, at least in the technology path of the tools that we have today.
Okay. That's that's a really good explanation. I've had this discussion philosophically, and I think it's the best explanation I've heard for why AI would not behave actually consciousness, even if it mimics consciousness.
Right.
So something could mimic consciousness and not be conscious. And
Yeah.
humans might not. One day it might get so good we absolutely can't tell.
Right.
Which
And
I guess kind of
we're
leads. Oh,
we
sorry.
may be there now. Oh, I was just going to say, and in fact, in many ways, we may be there now. And when you look at the outputs of the chat models, the materials that they produce are amazing. I use them all the time. For me, for example, so I'm very creative. I love to create. I write. I compose music. I do all these different things. I cannot draw, and I will wish that I could draw, but the LLMs and the dollies and all these sorts of things have opened up a world for me where I'm able to create imagery now using that tool, which I never would have had the ability to do. Incredibly powerful stuff. So yeah, incredible tools, but I don't think they're going to get conscious the way we're conscious. Some other way. that's fine. But
It's about their way without emotions and personality. Um, so you write, you have a sci-fi book, am I correct?
I do, yeah.
You,
Um,
what's the name of it? Remind us of
it's
the
called
name.
it's called Nexus. I have. No, I can show you a picture. So hopefully that is not as reversed for you as it is for me. Um,
It's not.
okay. The this book came out from a conversation I had with a different author who had written a book about syntropy, and when I was introduced to the term and the ideas for it, I was it was clear that this was a critical concept that needed to be shared. And his book is very scientific in nature. So it talks about experiments that have been done where people, for example, detect that we actually do respond to things in the future prior to the things occurring. It's in fact one of the most amazing experiments that's been done is one where they'll have a system that's monitoring your heart and responses, and then gives you a choice of I want you to pick one square on the screen out of four. And if you pick the square that is going to have an image behind it, you actually get a physiological response in your heart from being right about it. But what was amazing about this is you get the response slightly before you find out whether or not you were right. And in fact, even more so, you get a response slightly before the computer decides whether you were right or not. So even the moment slightly before it determines which is the square that it was going to have the image behind, your heart has responded to that. So this is amazing stuff. And I said, and I told the author of this, and I said, look, this is incredible, but rather than writing a technical book on it, we should, I didn't say we, I said you should write a book that makes this much more comfortable for people. Express it if in fiction if you need to, but introduce the ideas in a much less scientific way so people can get used to it. And he turned back to me and he said, Jeff, that's a great idea, but I don't write that kind of thing. You do it. And that was the beginning of where this book came from. It actually started off as a radio play, and then transformed into a screenplay, and then eventually into the book form. But it is, it's a novel that it tells a great story. You don't need to know anything about Syntropy to enjoy it. It tells about characters and life and death, and has all the elements of your traditional novel. But if you are inclined to the philosophy behind it, you can dive in, and you can start to see implications about what would a society look like that recognized purpose, or focused on purpose more than causes, that was more about interconnectedness than disparate societies and things like that. So ultimately, the book, it really is about balance. It's about recognizing the importance of every point on the spectrum, whatever that spectrum is. If it's yin to yang, or future to past, or whatever it is, it's realizing that balance is the path forward for us.
And so much of sci-fi. So your sci-fi book is based on true concepts, or concepts that have been, as far as we understand, because I think we seem to, as we learn more, our understanding of what's true in the world seems to constantly evolve. Do you tend to think most science fiction ends up coming true? Like, for example, even us talking on Zencaster or Zoom used to be in science fiction only.
Oh, sure,
You know,
yeah.
if you looked at something in the 1970s, you look at an old movie, this is pure science fiction. So, do you think most science fiction ends up coming true?
Yeah, and I think it happens in two different ways, from two different styles of science fiction in my experience. There's science fiction like I was just describing with Nexus. That's a little different. So, for example, I took these ideas of syntropy, which is a science, and then I fictionalized it. So I pushed it a little bit over the edge, right, so that it made for a good story. But it was, there's I think some books that are sci-fi that are coming about because they're talking about things that are truly important in the nature of humanity, the nature of the universe, and so forth. And they're things that are waiting to be uncovered. Um, and then there are sort of science fiction books that, not just books, but science fiction in general, that challenge us to figure out really clever ways of doing things that we want to do. Star Trek being, sort of the perfect example of this. The idea of replicators and the communicators and all this, and then one day you wake up and you realize that you've got cell phones and 3D printers and all these sorts of things that were inspired in this way, because we put a challenge out there that said, wouldn't it be cool if we were able to do this sort of thing? And we find them technologically. We find technological solutions to that. But I think there are also this other category of sci-fi elements that they speak to something that's much deeper. Maybe we don't always categorize it as sci-fi. We might look at that as mythology, right? For example, the myth of Eros and Psyche is actually telling us something about what the next age of humanity might be like if we sort of wake up into the age of Aquarius and say, you know what, I really think we as a species should start focusing on spirit and soul, right? What would our world look like at this point? And that those kinds of myths can be guidelines for how we might uh, embody that within ourselves. So we can see it all over the place.
Do you ever think time travel could be possible?
Funny you should ask. Somebody just asked me to write a piece of a screenplay about time travel. I think time travel is possible, but I think we need to really take a step back and ask ourselves what we mean by it. And particularly, what is it that travels in time, right? So this is a catch. I think that because in my mind, right, time is something that we as conscious beings assert. I think that people do in their own way time travel all the time. They have experiences. I would say that an example of precognition that somebody has is an example of time travel. Um, when you think about cases where sort of the science fiction time travel picture, right? Which is, I am bodily going to disappear from this moment and I'm going to bodily reappear at some point in what I consider to be the future. It's a different kind of thing. I don't think it's likely to happen as the result of technology. Spiritual growth strikes me as a far more promising way of doing that sort of thing. What does it mean, for example, if for me to time travel back 20 years to a point in my history where I was, say, in better shape or whatever, right? What's going back there? Is it the physical form of me now, or is it my consciousness that is going to go back to an earlier time and focus there as the consciousness at that point? So, in some sense, I would say that we do it already. And the trick is to change what we have sort of conscious awareness of. So, if I go back 20 years and I time travel in that sense, well, I have the awareness of those intervening 20 years when I go back 20 years. Um, right? But somebody who has the premonition that somebody is going to call them 5 minutes from now, and then they call them 5 minutes from now, isn't that in its own way kind of a time traveling circumstance as well? Certainly, awareness traveling through time seems to be the first step. Um, but physically, I would be far. I find it almost impossible to say that anything's impossible. I came across an amazing story last week about a woman in Brazil who manifests objects, physical objects, out of cotton. She's been doing it for 70 years. She started when she was 5. Mind blowing, right? Here's some of the physically manifesting these things. uh, as a an avenue for sort of spiritual cleansing, as she described it. She's not making any money. She never wanted to be famous. She just does the things she does. If she's doing that, then things moving around through space and time, hey, anything's possible. Amazing
Right.
stuff.
Yeah. I never, after studying this stuff, thinking there was zero chance of an afterlife or anything, after everything I've learned, I don't think anything's impossible anymore either. So,
Yeah,
I mean, I've had nothing but just absolute worldview changing things happen since studying this or reading about worldview things happening, worldview changing things happening, to say it
indeed.
properly. Um, so we're going a little over an hour. Do you have about another 10 minutes or so?
Sure. Yeah. I don't
Oh,
have anything.
great. Oh, good. Okay. So you work with physics. Were you a physicist? I'm sorry. Did you study physics? Can you clarify
Yeah.
what you said in the opening about
So,
physics?
background wise, when I was an undergraduate, I was a mechanical engineer. I went off for a couple of years and did environmental engineering, just kind of fell into that. And then when I decided I wanted to get into some other things, I had started picking up database development as a hobby at the time, but went back to school for physics, and it was my intent was I wanted to study relativity. That's what I went back for, and then I realized that if I was going to study relativity, or I should say, if I was going to get my PhD in relativity, it's going to take me like 10 years. And I was talking with somebody who said, "Well, I have a project doing nuclear physics that is sort of ready to go." So decided to do nuclear physics because I could get my PhD in about 5 years. And I was like, okay, I'll do that, and then I can study whatever I want, of course, with my life. So I did that, and but then nearing the end of that, I got fascinated by acoustics. I started realizing that there was a lot of knowledge about acoustics that people had thousands of years ago that we've kind of lost. And I became really interested in what sound and vibration potentially could do. So I did my PhD was in nuclear physics, but then I sort of, as soon as I finished, I went off and uh, focused on acoustics after that.
Okay. So then, with your knowledge of physics, and I don't expect an accurate answer, but just if you could guess, how do you think it works? Consciousness not in a brain, non local consciousness, our consciousness quantum entangles with our brain while we're here, and then our experiences here upload to who we are. How does this all work if our consciousness is not created by a brain and ends after we physically die?
Yeah. The I think the first thing is that consciousness is sort of the thing. The idea of the physical world is a description of what is there. And I don't mean it to say that the description isn't important. It's simply the description of what it is. So the brain is an important piece of this because what we're describing is something that's fundamental, but the physicality of that is not, far from captures the totality of it. Everything that I've come across, the data that I've seen suggests that a much better analogy for what the brain is doing is as an antenna. It's what is sort of represents our ability to focus. And in many ways, it may be that the reason that we dream at night, that we release ourselves from experiences that are confined to one life, one consciousness, one path in a physical world, is because it's exhausting to stay there, and it's actually us taking that moment to go, whew, all right, let me take a breath before I wake up in the morning, and I focus in on only the things that I'm going to focus in on, because that but that brain becomes, as a transceiver or as an antenna, is a very good model for this. It meets a lot of the criteria that people feel are important. For example, well, if I lose this section of the brain, does that part of consciousness disappear? I would say the part of consciousness itself does not disappear, but the ability to access it, to incorporate it into our normal, quote unquote, normal life, right? That disappears because I'm no longer accessing it in the traditional way of living a life as I normally would. So just as you uh, you can sort of get yourself wrapped around the axle trying to ask um, questions that sort of lead you into a corner. If you take that approach, a lot of this stuff makes more sense, and it helps you identify questions that are kind of misleading. So you read, well, how is it that consciousness emerges from the brain? Well, you're kind of out of luck right from the moment you ask the question, because you presume something about consciousness that probably isn't valid. It's sort of like saying, well, we're going to take the radio apart and figure out how all the rock stars managed to write and compose all their music inside the diodes in my transistor radio. Like, they don't. But it's true that if you break the radio, you're not going to hear the music anymore, right? Um, but I think what's going on is that there is consciousness. It is out there, right? And when we focus ourselves on that narrative that is our lives, right? We do that by focusing in, by just paying attention to those things that we can transcribe or what have you, uh, in a brain like way that all it sort of makes it all make sense. And then there's other pieces of this that are get harder, right? Like, how is it that a small child born in 1970 whatever has incredible exquisite knowledge of what it's like to be a fighter during World War II? But they do, right? This is an example case of what happens. What is it that allows that to happen? Well, that brain perhaps is still tuning into some stuff that isn't quite as focused as we traditionally like to think that it's going to be. So it's picking up other stuff, and then eventually the person learns to filter that out too, and then they often move into sort of the normal life of a person with just one set of memories. But I think that everything out is out there, and we as perceptual beings uh, can train ourselves to have a broader set of perceptual experiences, and to train ourselves to have a much narrower one. Right, and I think mostly what we do in childhood is training ourselves to have a much narrower one, to focus in on the things that we're supposed to focus in on. Um,
And I actually have a question I should have asked way before, but regarding the random event generators and random number generators, was there a higher level of effect in the different scenarios? For example, the focused intention versus the experiment done when people passed away versus the Global Consciousness Project, which is just reading the general consciousness. Does one of those seem to have the highest or strongest effect?
it's very difficult to say what is a strong effect in this, because the data is very hard to compare in that sense, because it's different data taken under different protocols with different expectations. Um, there were certain uh, commonalities that were observed in general, and I'm now going to use the language of the late 1970s and the 1980s. Um, they for and and in that language, the way it was described is that they noticed, for example, that men and women had different styles of effects, in general, not always, but in general. If they were doing it today, if I were doing it right now, perhaps is a better way of saying it, I probably would be more likely to ascribe it to yin and yang personalities rather than gender. But that was the language of the 80s. So, that's the way it is. But different styles of personalities definitely had different effects. And then going back to the men and the women, map it as you will. For example, women tended to have stronger effects, but often the effect would go in the opposite direction of the intention. Men tended to be more likely to have an effect that was going in the direction of intention, but tended not to be as strong of an effect as the women had. then you sort of naturally ask the question, what if you took men and women, or just in general bonded pairs of people, and had them work as a team to have the experiments? And in fact, they as a team uh, had a different style, a different signature for the kinds of things that they would do. But again, very difficult to compare, because all of this is still relatively new. There's a lot of dimensionality to this that is hard to trace, because it's tied to one's state of mind, one's state of heart, all these different things. It makes it very difficult to compare. And you have to be fair about it scientifically, you have to treat it statistically, which means you can't just take one run and then say, aha, this one run has this conclusion. You have to take 100 runs or 1,000 runs and look at the behavior statistically over time to say something is really meaningful that's going on that way. So it makes it very challenging to narrow it in. And the work that was done then, for example, was very specific in the sense that sit you down, we'll run an experiment, the experiment's over. Take the Global Consciousness Project, that's not how that works, right? That project has an ongoing stream of data collection, and it's not clear that there's a beginning or an end to anything in those, right? So it's a very different protocol.
Okay, and now get close to winding down the talk, but I want to ask you, what is the most like what the fuck mind blowing results you've seen? That is there anything? I mean, you grew up around this your whole life, so maybe you're pretty accustomed to it. But is there anything you would just call a what the fuck, or just blew you away in results that you had, or maybe a personal experience or something someone shared? Anything that you would say is the biggest what the fuck?
Well, I got to tell you that manifestation of physical objects that I was telling you, that's like, oh my god, what? That's mind blowing, for sure. In terms of specifically of the pair research, though, in terms of the pair research, it was not the biggest one. Really, was at some point, maybe 3, 4, 5 years ago, when I started to really be in the position of explaining what it was that was done. Right now, so my mother passed away a couple of years ago, and prior to that, when people would ask about the para research, she would answer the questions very naturally because she was the one doing the research. So I never had to really formulate good explanations for all of this. But in recent years, well, she's not present in a way, at least, that she can answer those questions for people, right? And so now I'm answering those questions, and I have to find ways of explaining it. And how do you affect something that happened a month ago or 10 years ago or whatever is a big one. And so figuring out and really internalizing what that means, right? The idea that in order for all of this to make sense, to reconcile, to look at the data and say, I'm not going to throw away the data that's uncomfortable. I'm going to respect the fact that the results are the results. You have to live with what the results are. And in order to do that, I had to really step back and ask myself, well, what is time? What does that mean? And that honestly has been probably the biggest what the fuck for me, because I've started to recognize that I have to change the way that I think about the things that happen in my life, and I have to loosen my grip substantially on things like, well, that happened because of whatever. So if I have something that comes up, and I look at it and I go, why did that happen? I have to recognize that I may not get the answer to that for another 6 months or 6 years or whatever it is. And that's completely changed the way that I view the world and view myself in it. I've had a couple of moments like that. One years ago, where I was sitting in front of a waterfall, And rather than all of a sudden sort of seeing the world as I normally do, which is the world's filled with things, the things have stories about them, all of a sudden I had this moment, lasted maybe 30 seconds, where everything took a turn. And instead of seeing things that had stories, I saw stories that wove together. And things were simply what happened when stories came together. Totally changed the way that I viewed the world at that point. Same thing with this. Yeah, it was mind blowing.
I don't really know what you mean. You mean like just the stories, like it's
Like
about love and then like the facts almost didn't matter? Like what do you mean by
like
that?
all of this, like think of the world as being created by sort of the all the archetypal stories that are there, the hero's journey, the this, that, the other, and all of the pieces that come together, and all these archetypes that have their own stories, that when you look at an individual becomes the accumulation of all these stories put together in the uniqueness of just how they intersect in this one particular way. Um, but for going back to the time thing, because I know we've got only so much time in the interview. Earlier today, I was at a book signing event at a local store, and I got into a conversation with this young woman who came by, and it was cool. We had a great conversation. But in that, as we were having it, I found myself really asking myself, is the entire purpose for me being in the store for this, which I thought prior to that was simply to get the word out about the book. But then I found myself thinking, you know what? It may very well be that the only reason I was in the store at all was to have this one conversation with this one young woman, which wasn't actually all that much about the book that I was there to promote anyway, right? It was about something else. And you ask yourself, like, I don't really know what was driving what. I simply know that we're working together as a coherent system. It's an interconnected universe, and it changes the way that I view these things. And that's been very transformative for me. I see things very differently, which is also very nice because I'm much less likely to insert judgments, jump to conclusions. It keeps me curious, and I like that state of mind.
I like that too, and it does similar for me. I just have to ask you, I can't let this go. The manifestation of objects. Did you actually witness this ever, or you just heard that it happened?
I saw a presentation that somebody else gave, and I'll put in a plug that I was so moved by the presentation that I've asked her to do a repeat of the presentation, the woman who gave it, uh, on May 4th on the Saturday. So she's going to do that again. It's free, and you're welcome to join it. It's
I would love to.
Yeah. So what I personally witnessed were her listening to her accounts. She had gone there. She met with a woman and so forth, and saw
The woman
all
who
that happened.
manifests cotton
Woman who
pieces.
manifest. She showed pictures of the things that were manifested. She showed some videos of her doing the manifesting, and related some of the stories about that. So I did see video of it. I didn't see it with my own eyes, but it was the videos were pretty compelling. And I think one of the things that was helpful for me, and I always sort of am always moved by this, which is the difference between people who do these things for the purpose of making money or getting famous. This woman never made any money. She's been doing this since she was 5. She's in her 70s now. She never charges money for it. She's never tried to get famous for it. She simply does what she does. There are millions of people all through Brazil who have personal experiences of this. It's just the rest of the world who doesn't seem to know much about it. And that to me is very telling. Like I probably would have felt very different if she was like, and I'll show you this for $500 or something like that. Like, okay, but there is none. There, she doesn't charge money. She says you do have to pay for the wool or the cotton that she uses because she can't afford to buy an infinite amount of cotton. So there's some trivial amount of money to get a little bit of cotton that you use for it. But it's wild. Yeah, it's worth seeing. It
Oh,
definitely. And the more you hear about this, the more you realize there's a lot of stories of things that are truly fantastic. I'm editing a book right now, one that ICRL will be releasing later this year, uh, entitled "Verifying Spiritual Reality," where the author Robert Trayer did a phenomenal job of collecting experiences from people that talk about these amazing things that just defy the traditional physicality or materialism worldview, just over and over and over. And you realize that there's a lot of really incredible stuff going on. We just tend not to talk about it a lot.
And knowing physics, do you have any theory how the materialization of these cotton pieces? So she gets the cotton and then it manifests it because you have to pay for the cotton into just objects. Is that like
Yep.
it almost makes itself into these sculptures like
Well, it's
using
not.
her
I
mind?
don't think it's the cotton that's making itself. I think the cotton's as, and in fact, the woman's sort of termed the cotton medium. I think the cotton is simply the mechanism for doing the manifestation. It's not, So I asked, what kind of things. Sometimes it's miscellaneous pieces of clothing, or a candle, or an old packet of medicine, or a lock, or whatever. A dead goat was one of them. All kinds of different things that she is able to pull through out of this. From the physics perspective, sort of capitalizing on the opportunity to talk to that. No, I have no explanation for that from a physics perspective. In theory, going back to quantum mechanics, it's quantum mechanically possible, but it's so vastly unlikely that I just can't. There's no explanation to be had there. But it does sort of raise the question: is what is it that the laws of physics are really telling us? And my personal answer to that, in reconciling sort of these two different sides of my life, is that the laws of physics are actually telling us mostly about ourselves. They're telling us about the way that we relate to our experiences or our perceptions. How do we take those sensations that we have as a conscious being and form a narrative out of that? A narrative that involves having physical stuff, right? A desk that I can touch, a friendship that I can feel in my heart, light that I can see. How all this works? The laws of physics are really a description of our own model of how we explain these things and how we relate them to ourselves so that we can think back on our experiences, how we relate them to other people so we can share our experiences with others in some new and exciting way. But I do think that the laws of physics, the laws of math, these are much more about us than they are about some objective universe, because there's not a lot of evidence that the universe is the objective thing that we tend to think of it as.
Um, and so, I mean, I can't think of anything better to end on except let me ask you, is there anything I didn't ask you that you want to add? Anything I want me to ask you or that you'd like to add?
No, it's been a fantastic conversation. I think we probably could continue to talk for hours about all the different aspects of this.
I
Uh,
know I wanted to, but I feel it
yeah,
would not be fair to keep you for 5 hours. Although
we'll do
I
it again
would,
at some point. Yeah,
yeah.
no limit to be sure. No, I would just say to anybody listening, try to keep an open mind. The don't rush into dismissing things. I'm not saying to be gullible, right? Not all things you hear are true. That's not the case, and it's not that everything that somebody claims is going to necessarily be true. But the secret to sort of finding those things is learning to listen with an open mind, a critical mind, right, an evaluative mind, but not to throw away data or experiences simply because they don't fit with what you already know. Because otherwise, all you will know is what you already know. And you didn't have a childhood, whoever you are, even me, is the weirdest childhood around, did not have all the experiences, right? You only get a few. And just trying to recognize that just because it's not something that you've experienced doesn't mean it's not a valid experience, or worth considering or exploring. That's I think, a really important part for us to, if we're gonna survive into 50 years from now, right? What is that going to take? It's going to take people who are open minded, who have learned to appreciate differences, right? Who aren't trying to make everybody else look just like them, and realize that, yeah, there's good things in hearing new experiences from different people who see the world a different way, and to be open to that. So,
And where can we find you, get your book, follow um, some of the books you're editing and publishing for others, and
yeah,
stay in touch? Or
by all means. So my website for ICRL is simply icrl.org. That's a great starting point. We're in the process of modernizing it. So if you go there and in the next month or two and you go, "Ooh, this is kind of a dated website," I know, we're working on it. But there's a lot of good content there, and whenever we have events, we always post it up there. I'm not the greatest at social media, but I try to keep things up to date on our Facebook page. And on the website, you'll see, our connection content. So connect@icrl.org. We'll get emails, and we typically respond pretty quickly. The book, you'll see links for that too. It's the books on Nexus is available on Amazon as well. So if you search for Nexus, well, search for Nexus and my last name, Dunne, Dunne. If you just search for Nexus, you get shampoo. So that's not it. Uh, but yeah, the website's definitely a good starting point for everybody.
And all links will be in the show notes. So thank you so much. I love this conversation. I've been so interested in the
Likewise.
history, and pear was one of the very early things I found very early on in my grief that gave me hope. So I really appreciate you coming on today.
It is my pleasure, Liz. Thank you so much for having me.
To get more information on what the fuck just happened, go to WTFJustHappened.net. There you can order my book, WTF Just Happened, A Sciencey Skeptic Explores Grief, Healing, and Evidence of an Afterlife. You can learn all about how I came to conclude that there most likely is an afterlife, but you can also learn about the early stages of my grief and the amazing, fascinating people I met along the way. You can read about how much I harassed the mediums and scientists trying to get evidence to see if the mediums were cheating and see if what everyone was saying actually was true. You can also subscribe to our newsletter to stay updated on any new developments and any interesting new what the fuck updates. So if you enjoyed this episode, please rate and review us wherever you get your podcasts. It makes such a difference, especially for a new podcast like this one. And if any of you have had a crazy what the fuck yourself, have any questions, feedback, or just want to say hey, reach out on either Instagram at WTF_just_happened_, or email me at hello@WTFJustHappened.net. I love hearing from all of you. It makes my day hearing your stories and questions and feedback and all of it. And remember, you don't have to draw any final conclusions as you wonder, what the fuck just happened?